the outset of the Ukraine war, 2022, the full-scale invasion, I asked somebody, well, how many artillery shells have we got? And in the end, the answer was enough for about 8 days at full whack for the artillery in the army.
Yeah.
Well, as we know, it's nearly 3 years now with the war in Ukraine. So 8 days wouldn't have made much of an impact.
It was reported that Labour's pledge to increase defence spending could be delayed until the 2030s as market turmoil put further pressure on the public finances. And yet, Donald Trump threatened last week that the US won't protect allies that don't meet defence spending targets, which he put at 5%, which is a lot higher than the 2.3% the UK currently spends. Mark, does he mean that 5% thing, or is he just saying it to be mean?
Well, not even the US meets that 5% of the economy on defence target at the moment. So he has put it out there. The general view in Whitehall seems to be, will the landing zone be sort of 3.5 or 3? But the problem is in the UK, we're having great trouble getting to 2.5%. And that's an increase which over the course of this parliament, if it was done quickly, could cost public finances, say, 20 billion. And we're in a rather unreal world at the moment because we've had a lot of quite stark language from the senior military and from ministers in the outbound government, and indeed from Keir Starmer during the election campaign about the dangers of the world right now and what a dire situation we're in, that the lack of preparedness, the armed forces really are in a bit of a state. They had years in which they had to kill Taliban in pickup trucks and, people who fired ground-to-air missiles or torpedoes or whatever at them were not part of the calculation. They've now got to think about war on that scale again. And that's hugely expensive. And then we've got this situation which is worsening as we speak, I believe, in the bond markets, where trying to bridge the gap between what the government brings in with taxes and what it spends is becoming more and more expensive. So they are in a very, very tricky situation. And I'm told that the people who are looking at this, there's this defence review going on, so didn't quite screw the paper up into a ball and chuck it into the waste paper basket this time last week. But there have been big ructions in Whitehall following these interventions by Trump, because suddenly, the sort of track they thought they might be on to 2.5%, and possibly something a bit higher than that, has been called into question. All these other issues have been raised by Trump about Greenland, Canada, fellow NATO members. And so it's fair to say the thing is in a state of flux. There are going to have to be some very hard questions asked in Whitehall and Downing Street about what can the UK afford and how does it manage this relationship with Trump if, as was suggested in the Mail on Saturday, the Treasury position is we can't even go to 2.5% this Parliament, i.e. by 2030.
I mean, putting aside the fact that we haven't got enough money, because for the purposes of this show, that's Paul Johnson's problem and not yours, judging it merely in terms of how much we spend, I mean, surely that's just nonsense, because we could get the numbers up enormously by, I don't know, properly equipping an aircraft carrier. But if that's not what we need actually for any looming future conflict, what are we talking about actually spending money on?
Well, so have we got the money? I did this piece. It's on the Sunday Times website yesterday, and it was quite interesting. Among the responses was one from a former senior policy guy at the Ministry of Defence, who said politics is about choices and we're wasting an awful lot of money on carbon capture and other technologies which aren't really proven yet that could be invested in some of these areas. Now, I know lots of listeners may disagree with that if the green issues are their thing. But, there are still choices. Another piped up, if we didn't give 9 billion to Mauritius over the Chagos, that would come in handy at the Ministry of Defence. So there are choices. There is more leeway than the government would suggest. What's it to be spent on? The real problem for the British Armed Forces, I mentioned, years of chasing around people in pickup trucks in Afghanistan and that kind of thing, is what they call magazine depth. Which is all those things like missiles, torpedoes, they're really expensive things that can cost millions a shot. Our magazine depth is very, very limited. So, for example, at the outset of the Ukraine war, 2022, the full-scale invasion, I asked somebody, well, how many artillery shells have we got? And in the end, the answer was enough for about 8 days at full whack for the artillery in the army.
Yeah.
Well, as we know, it's nearly 3 years now with the war in Ukraine. So 8 days wouldn't have made much of an impact. And so I think the first priority in terms of spending this money is to deal with some of these problems. And some of that is going on, new factory to make shells, new production of things like those anti-tank missiles that we sent thousands of to Ukraine, to replace the ones we gave them and to make more for us. So some of these things are happening, but it's happening very slowly. And the big ticket, really expensive items, things like, submarines, combat aircraft, that is still a huge money business, let alone, some people talking about, could we have a sort of shield against missile attacks on the UK, which is just mind-blowing amounts of money.
Yeah. How important are troops? Because, writing in the Sunday Times this week, you sort of highlight the fact that there is this, although people in Britain seem to support the army and the armed forces quite a lot, there does seem to be a marked reluctance to join it.
Yeah, look, there's this, there is this duality, this confusion. So it's the same on spending. If you poll people, I think I've got a figure in there from a recent poll of 71% say, yes, let's spend more on defence. Seems convincing. Of course, when you ask people the question in an open way and say, well, what are your priorities? What do you think the government should spend more on? Defence comes like 7th or 8th, after health, education, infrastructure, all those other things. So people are a bit odd about this, and the same goes to attitudes to service. So you would think that a country like the UK, 68 million people, would not have difficulty finding in the 2023 to 4 year just over 10,000 people that it needed for the army.
Doesn't seem a lot, 10,000,
no,
does it?
From a population of that size.
Yeah.
And yet they fell 3,700 short. So they fell a third short, just over, on that target. They couldn't recruit that number of people from the UK population. So, that's another sort of paradox in a sense. If you poll people and say, do you think we've got good armed forces and are they professional? Generally people have a pretty positive impression about the armed forces in this country, but they don't really want to join them. And that in the end, if Britain is going to get serious about building resilience and capability and reserves and all the things you need if you're going to have a larger scale of war, comes back to the question of some kind of draft or conscription. Howls of horror when Rishi Sunak threw that one down during the last election campaign. But what he was suggesting was what in some of the Scandinavian countries they have, which is a sort of very selective thing that would bring in a few thousand people, particularly in those areas like cyber warfare and certain other very technical areas where it's a real problem to find young people in this country who will do that voluntarily. But, as we saw, the reaction in the last election campaign was not exactly encouraging.
I guess the alternative is we just make it a more attractive job like they do in the
More
United
money.
States,
Yeah, more money, more stability, better quarters and things like that. Yeah, all of those things would help.
Yeah. Let's talk briefly about China. Rachel Reeves has just got back. She was courting investment in renewable energy. What do we think? What do other people think about the influence this could give the Chinese state on Britain, British infrastructure? How vulnerable?
Well,
these are all topics that have been floating around for years, seem unresolved.
Yes, it's the old sort of devil and deep blue sea argument, isn't it, about intensified trade with China. And really, since George Osborne made a similar trip and came back with what he thought were a load of rather good commitments on the part of China, for example, to deal in the London financial markets, we've been going down and down and down for lots of reasons. And of course, the pressure from the first Trump administration was one of the big engines in limiting British trade over the last decade. With China. Of course it's a prize, and of course the Chancellor, who's desperate for investment, wants the prize. The front page of the Times today is quoting Richard Dearlove, the former chief of MI6, saying, one of the things she's looked at is this big investment in solar panel factories in the UK, which he argues, for various reasons, could be a national security threat. So those are the questions. We had all this before with Huawei, the telecoms company, which also invested in the UK, but that became quite a problematic thing. Rachel Reeves apparently doesn't have much to show. This figure of a 600 million contract over 5 years is obviously small beer, with two economies the size of China's and ours. We've really got to see, I think, when she either reports to the Commons or or in some other context, whether there's any more to it than that, because she has taken a considerable political risk going there. One can only imagine once the Trump administration is inaugurated and firing on all cylinders, how hostile they'll be towards deepening trade ties between the UK and China.
Finally, Mark, just to keep you on your toes, let me throw South Korea at you, because President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment trial begins this week. He's been holed up in the presidential residence since being suspended and impeached last month. What's gonna happen there? Has stability returned to South Korea? What's the picture?
That's an extraordinary story in a way, and I think it is worth mentioning because these events, and listeners may remember this rather curious and cat-handed attempt by him to declare martial law, to basically shut down the parliament and try and rule, by decree. It all went wrong within hours, and all sorts of things have happened since then. And really, they've kind of shattered South Korea's reputation as a kind of bastion of stability in industry and innovation in that part of the world. I think it is very problematic for them as a country. So, for example, they've set this trial date for tomorrow, but they've also set another one because the people who are now trying to bring him to justice believe he may well just try and ignore it. And this instability has shown itself, for example, in the exchange rate between the South Korean currency and the dollar and other regional currencies like the Japanese yen. So that's now down to a level that it was last at in 2009. And I think that speaks to the fact that as long as this instability persists in South Korea, it's a very, very tricky problem for what we might loosely call the West. The US-led family of nations, obviously including Japan, South Korea, and even to some extent Taiwan in the Pacific context, who, for example, the US tries to rally against China on tech and all sorts of other things. So, still trouble ahead, I think, for South Korea.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. You can, of course, hear Mark this time every Monday on the show, and you can read them in the Sunday Times as well. Thank you, Mark.